Do you ever feel like it is just getting harder and harder to just stop? For all of the freedom of information, connectivity, and access that the World Wide Web and our digital age has ushered in, it's also come at a price. The widespread use of smartphones and other digital devices has meant that being always on call is now a reality in many workplaces, as continuous remote access creates pressure for employees to be constantly accessible. And that has meant that for millions of us, even if you weren't working from home, work still kind of found a way to follow you there. But things might actually be changing. Since the early 2010s, countries and companies around the globe have been legislating and regulating something called the right to disconnect, a worker's right to be able to disengage from work and refrain from engaging in work-related electronic communications such as emails or other messages during non-work hours. And this isn't just a feel-good work perk. Some countries have gone so far to label the intrusion on employees' private lives as potentially hazardous to workers' health, and have enshrined work-life balance as a human right in national laws with legal and monetary penalties for businesses that don't respect it. And one US state might actually be next. So, let's take a look. The shift to remote working has blurred the line between home and work life for many people, leaving them answering calls, texts, and emails at all hours of the night. And this has prompted numerous countries around the globe to draft laws to protect the right to disconnect. Here in Europe, the European Union defines the right to disconnect as a worker's right to be able to disengage from work and refrain from engaging in work-related electronic communications such as emails and other messages during non-work hours. And while technically this right has not actually yet passed into EU law, a resolution passed in January 2021 which called for an EU directive to be established. But this does follow moves by several member states who have already established legal precedent. France, seen by many as the pioneer in this area, enacted legislation in August of 2016 allowing employees to switch off phones and other devices outside of set working hours. Companies with 50 or more employees are obligated to draw up a charter of good conduct, setting specific hours when staff can't send or receive emails. Portugal labels its work-life balance legislation the right to rest, with companies of 10 or more staff facing fines for contacting outside of set working hours. And in Italy, a country who already had established the right to disconnect law, took things one step further in 2021 and regulated that even remote working must be organized in time slots, such as to guarantee a disconnection slot of time. And so looking globally, there are actually just shy of 20 countries that have enshrined national laws or enacted regulations protecting this right to disconnect. But I don't actually think that statistic tells the full story on just how prevalent work-life balance policies are here in Europe, where a number of companies have actually enacted regulations to protect a worker's right to disconnect through multinational agreements, and ultimately the spillover that has even into smaller companies. For example, right here in Germany, technically speaking, we don't actually have a national law relating to the right to disconnect. But German companies, at the behest of unions and workers' councils, have a history of implementing policies to the same effect. Volkswagen, for example, actually implemented a policy all the way back in 2011, stating that it would stop email servers from sending emails to mobile phones of employees between 6 p.m. and 7 a.m. Soon thereafter, other German companies such as Allianz, Telekom, Bayer, and Henkel followed suit, enacting similar policies in place to limit the amount of digital connection employees have after work hours. And in one of my favorite stories in 2014, automobile company Daimler introduced a software called Mail on Holiday that its employees could use to automatically delete incoming emails while they were on vacation, allowing them to truly take a break and come back to work feeling refreshed. And this general attitude of providing workers with a clearer definition of work-life balance is really culturally significant here in Europe. And ultimately, science backs this up. Employment law, workplace relationships, and workers' rights have undergone some pretty fundamental changes in just the past few decades, especially in our ever-connected digital age. But because the debate on work-life balance is such a highly partisan and lobby topic, you might not know what is actually going on if you only ever read a few news sources or rely on social media algorithms to tell you what's going on. That's why I always use our sponsor, Ground News, because it gives me an easy, data-driven, and objective way to read the news. On Ground News, every story comes with a quick visual breakdown of political bias, factuality, and the ownership of sources reporting, all backed by ratings from 3 independent news monitoring organizations. For example, this recent story on Assembly Bill 2751 in California, which, if passed, would grant workers the right to disregard routine work messages outside of work hours, was covered by 37 news outlets, and I've been using their new comparison feature to see specific differences in left and right reporting. For this story, a left-leaning outlet highlighted that the proposed law aims to alleviate worker burnout by limiting when employers can contact their employees after work hours, while a right-leaning outlet claims that the law would, quote, let employees ignore bosses after work calls and messages. If one side of the political spectrum is ignoring the story, the blind spot feed will let you know so you can make up your own mind about how reliable the reporting is, which is a level of transparency that I very much appreciate when I'm sorting through the data and reports for different subjects on my channel. So go head over to ground.news/Ashton or click the link down the description of this video. You can subscribe through my link to get 40% off the Vantage subscription, which includes unlimited access to all of their amazing features. Plus, when you subscribe, you not only support me, but you're also supporting an independent platform trying to make the news more transparent. Decades of research shows an association between workplace burnout and techno-stress with a host of negative organizational, psychological, and even physical consequences. And this expectation that the ideal worker will be at the beck and call of their employer at all hours of the day, of course, comes at a high cost to human health, well-being, and worker productivity. And the presumption that frontline, shift, and retail workers must be on call or risk losing their job is a source of intense misery. We even think so much about work that researchers have dubbed the phenomenon work-related rumination. Research shows that when the body never has a chance to rest and recover, levels of the stress hormone cortisol remain so high that the body begins to wear down. And according to leading scientific research, employees who experience true workplace burnout have a 57% increased risk of workplace absence greater than 2 weeks due to illness, 180% increased risk in developed depressive disorders, an 84% increased risk in type 2 diabetes, and a 40% increased risk in hypertension. Plus, studies have found that even the thought that you might get a late-night email from the boss was the source of high anxiety, forcing the brain into a hyper-vigilant mode, unable to detach and rest. And all of this together may impair short-term memory, attention, and other cognitive processes that are essential for daily work activities. In short, we're sicker and unhappier, and unsurprisingly, we're actually not very good employees when we're constantly in this cycle of stress without any opportunity to reset. And when workers en masse are suffering from burnout, worker productivity also drops, and they may become less innovative and more likely to make errors. And if this spreads through an organization, it can have serious negative impact on productivity, service quality, and the bottom line. And I think my own home country of the US is a prime example of this playing out in real time. In comparison to other G7 countries, Americans work more hours, have less vacation time, and are expected to be available or reachable after hours at far higher rates. Yet, we aren't actually better, more productive employees. Today, Americans work around 30% more than Europeans, and these differences are important as they explain almost all existing US-Europe differences in GDP per capita. GDP per capita, for example, is today 30% higher in the US than in France or Germany, while productivity measured in GDP per hour worked is roughly equal. And that means that, yes, technically speaking, Americans are richer than Europeans. But it's not because Americans are better employees, it's just that they work themselves more to death. And ultimately, that has pretty dire consequences for both the employee and the employer. Despite being richer, Americans are also much more likely to report being unhappy, suffer from higher rates of self-reported emotional distress, and actually tend to change jobs more frequently. Yeah, okay, so at this point in the video, you're probably wondering if the right to disconnect has all of these very clear, sustained positive effects on work-life balance and employee well-being, then why aren't they more widespread? Well, laws like these could, as those who oppose it argue, hurt startups and limit flexible work opportunities, which I actually think is really good leeway into us talking about California's proposed law. Earlier this year, a California lawmaker drafted a bill which would make it illegal for your boss to regularly contact you after hours, unless it was an emergency or to address work schedule issues. If the bill becomes law, any employer that violates it could face a fine of at least $100 per offense. If passed, the California bill would require employers to establish a company-wide policy on what their working hours are and how they will respect employees' right to disconnect. The law would not supersede any collective bargaining contracts and applies only to salaried workers, as hourly and gig workers are protected by other laws. But surprisingly, it's actually the California Chamber of Commerce who really doesn't like this proposal, calling the bill a blanket rule that is a step backward for workplace flexibility. In fact, the chamber actually added the bill to its annual job killer list of proposed state regulations and plans to testify in opposition if the bill ever gets a hearing. And others, like this chief marketing officer at a San Francisco-based venture capital firm, worries that laws could be too broad and hurt startups that often have to address issues at odd hours or put in extra work before a product push. Which, to be fair, I actually think is a little bit misinformed. To be honest, I read this bill and it doesn't actually have a whole lot of teeth. Technically speaking, it's actually only required that employers be transparent about their out-of-office contact hours expectations for their employees. Technically speaking, a company say that they expect their salaried employees to be contacted 24/7, and that would still be legal. Again, the law is just simply asking for transparency, not mandating that they respect their employees' personal lives. So in reality, the California law is kind of like a right to disconnect light, the diet soda, if you will, of European, Canadian, or Australian employment law. But like a lot of other workplace values, perhaps the way this law was written and the opposition to it is representative of a much larger difference in cultural attitudes on work-life balance. Broadly speaking, Americans value stuff, SUVs, 7,000 square foot houses, more than they value time. While for Europeans, it's kind of the opposite. After all, there's a reason why achieving the American dream is epitomized in one's ability to purchase a single-family home with a white picket fence. But there's a historical and religious component to this too. The puritanical version of Christianity that has always appealed to Americans, religion comes packaged with the stern message that hard work is good for the soul. We're proud of being busy. It's actually seen as a virtue, and taking time off is kind of a vice, which I think makes it all the more interesting that in some countries, they actually want to take the right to disconnect one step further. There's a strong movement at a more fundamental level that sees the right to disconnect as not just about employment law, but a rethinking of what fundamental human rights are in a new digital age. The right to disconnect shares similarities with several pre-existing human rights. The most notable of these is the right to rest and leisure found in Article 24 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This right explicitly places limitations on the amount of time people can work for, something that the right to disconnect takes further and places in the 21st century. The right to disconnect also crosses into Article 23, which states that everyone has the right to work and receive fair pay, and to join trade unions to protect their interests. I think we would all agree that the abuse of an employee's time is kind of modern slavery, and we probably wouldn't tolerate that kind of abuse in a regular workplace setting. But I think in the 21st century, in this digital age that we live in, the office is no longer a physical place that is defined by set working or opening hours. And we've all probably been in a situation where, your boss shoots you a text message at 9 o'clock on a weekday, well after your quitting time about something that probably could wait until the next day, but you might be worried that your supervisor will get upset if you don't answer. So you open your laptop and get back to work. I know I've been there plenty of times. And while it might only take 5 minutes to draft an email and send it off, well, that time does add up. Consider a full-time minimum wage worker earning the US federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour, who works just 15 minutes off the clock before and after their shift every day. That extra half an hour of unpaid work each day represents a loss to the worker and a gain to the employer of around $1,400 per year, including the overtime premiums that they actually should have been paid. That's nearly 10% of their annual earnings lost to their employer that can't be used for utilities, groceries, rent, or other necessities. And salaried workers feel the squeeze as well. According to a 2019 Gallup poll, 52% of full-time American workers report working more than 40 hours a week, 39% work at least 50 hours a week, and 18% work at least 60. Yet few of these workers are actually paid a penny of the overtime for all the extra hours that they put in on the job. Overtime pay is really no longer the norm. In fact, it actually isn't legally protected by the FMLA if you make over $35,568 a year. By the way, 85% of Americans do. As a result, Americans are working longer hours at lower wages, while employers and shareholders reap record profits. And while I don't think that the right to disconnect is going to just suddenly overnight fix all of our problems with overtime and wage inequality, I do think it is a step in the right direction in rectifying a lot of these imbalances that so many of us feel between work and personal life. And in my experience, when you improve the visibility of these kind of things, you also subsequently improve the enforceability of regulations. While I think a lot of us would like to say, yeah, well, I choose to work for my boss because he respects my private life, my reply would just say, well, isn't respect for private life something that shouldn't have to be a choice, but a standard that is to be expected? The thing is that employment regulations must be updated to deal with the use of software that allow us to be connected to our employment obligations 24 hours, 7 days a week. And the right to disconnect and the respect of workday limits is an employment human rights issue. As such, I personally think it probably should be overseen by regulators. But I would love to hear your thoughts down in the comment section of this video. I think as technology evolves and it allows all of us to be connected by laptops, cell phones, heck, smartwatches, we're constantly connected even when we're on our off time. And I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on how you think laws like these could make a positive or maybe a negative impact on the flexibility that workers have, while also respecting a better balance between work and leisure. So please let me know your thoughts down below. And as always, guys, if you enjoyed what you saw today, be sure to hit that thumbs up button. And for more content from Type Ashton, hit that subscribe button. So, I'll see you next Sunday. Cheers!